Ora tātou katoa, nau mai, haere mai, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. A very warm welcome to the Transitional Cathedral, the broad tent with a wide open door. Ko Dean Lawrence aho. I am the person who's in charge of the cathedral, and it's a very great privilege to welcome people from around our city today for this seminar on the Cannabis Legislation and Control referendum. I'm also collaborating with another Anglican organisation called Theology House to put this on today, and that's directed by Gareth Bazette, who's wearing a mask down the back. So I'd just like to acknowledge him and thank them for their willingness and ability to work with us. It's a pleasure to welcome our honoured guests and presenters today. Duncan Webb was going to chair this meeting, our local Christchurch Central MP. However, his plane was turned back from Wellington this morning because of fog. So if he gets here, it'll be later on this morning, but it's looking unlikely. So he's an apology today, unfortunately, which means that you have to put up with me running the meeting today. On our Zoom screen, we have a Green MP, Chloe Swarbrick, who is going to be one of our presenters, and she'll come through to us on the screen, so a very warm welcome to her. It's great to have with us Professor Joseph Boden from the Christchurch campus of the University of Otago, if I've got that right, and a Director of the Christchurch Health and Development Study, and a Science Advisor on the Prime Minister's expert panel on cannabis. So it's great to have you here with such an informed opinion. We also have Dr. Deborah Stevens, who is also a science communicator and educator, and also a member of the Interchurch Bioethics Council, with a special interest that includes values development and youth mental health. So wonderful to have you too, and welcome to you here. And back to our screen on the Zoom. There we have Sue Bagshaw, who is well known for her years of dedicated caring for disadvantaged young people. So she's coming in on Zoom. And finally, it's also wonderful to welcome among us our tikanga partner, Bishop Richard Wallace, who is the Bishop of Te Waiponanga, in other words, the South Island, and it'd be great to have your perspective. Welcome also to all of us who have gathered here in this cathedral to be part of this seminar today, and another very warm welcome to those who are watching this at home via the live stream on your device. A very warm welcome to you. This seminar is being recorded and will remain online so that people can come back to it later and watch and learn. We are in an Anglican cathedral, a house of prayer, but also where we can gather for community debates and dialogue, where we can have an open and honest discussion and hold different opinions and yet be under the guardianship of God. Shortly I'm going to ask Bishop Richard Wallace to open with prayer, but I do need to cover off the health and safety briefing. We are, of course, at COVID level 2 alert, so please make sure that you have signed in, either with the COVID Tracer app or physically using the sign in register. We are being asked to observe social physical distancing, which is why we've got the cushions sort of scattered around to give an idea of how far apart to sit. The toilets are in another building, a corrugated iron building just off to the side, so you have to go through one of the side exit doors to get to that. They are public toilets, so if you have children, make sure that they are accompanied. The exits you can see down the side of the building. If we have to get out there rapidly, just push the bar on the door and then you're out. The gathering space for fires is on that side of the building on the lawn. If it's an earthquake, drop, cover and hold. If we have to get out really fast, you can see where the exits are. I think that's all I need to say. Now I'd like to invite Richard Wallace to open with prayer, and we are asking everyone to speak through the single microphone because of the live stream and the Zoom, which is stretching us technologically. So to have both of those things happening, we can only have one microphone, so everyone's going to have to speak through this one, and we'll work that out as we go.
tautoko ngā mihi kua mihi a tiata nei. I support the speech you made this morning. Let us pray. Hei tiato kaharau e tūwherana ngā koe ka toko ki a koe. E mōhiotia ngā hia e kore hoki e ngaro i a koe te mea hona. Whakaangi i hua tō wairua kurungi e mātau e hui tahi nei. Mo tēnei taki nunui mui e tātou. Whakaruana tēnei mō te hia ngā rātau ka whakamau i roto o te ngaungau o tēnei o tēnei kaupapa. Nā rere e ti atua mō mātou e hūnei mai tīmata, mai mahi mai whakoti roti a koe, e whiwhi ai hoki mātou, te ora tonu e ata whai tēnei e koe, ko i hukrai te kutu tātou ariki. Father, we just ask you to be present among us this morning as we discuss this very, very important topic for our people. May we open our hearts and minds to one another and listen with intent and learn from one another. And although we may disagree on some points, Lord, we are just going to lift that up to you for your blessing. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen.
I should also acknowledge the presence of our Bishop Peter Carroll, who is with us as well. So I think what we're going to do now is just invite the presenters to speak for, I think it's around 10 or 15 minutes or something that we said. And let's start with Chloe from Wellington, Green MP, if we can do that. I'm hoping that someone else can figure out the necessaries with the technology. She'll come up on the screen. Morning, Chloe.
Morena, can you hear me?
You can hear me and we can hear you, which is great. And we can even see you on the screen. So over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation into the space. I am based in Auckland, so I'm currently beaming to you from a level 3 lockdown from my bubble, which is my tiny little apartment. So yeah, thank you all so much for facilitating this space and for coming to hear how we can engage and facilitate this kōrero with hopefully the best possible outcomes for wellbeing in our communities. And I know that there are a number of experts here. Sue will speak, of course, to younger people, and I'm also a big fan of Joe Boden's work. Joe Boden, not Joe Biden, for anybody who is following the DNC elections at present. But I will keep this from primarily a legal perspective, because I think that you have here a range of experts who are coming at it from kind of longitudinal impacts of particularly cannabis usage, and also the impacts on our younger people. What I think I potentially have to offer to this discussion is recognition, as I think all of us probably have, of the fact that cannabis can be harmful. Cannabis, like alcohol, like tobacco, like any other form of substance, can cause harm. So the question that we are facing is not whether cannabis should exist, because we have tried for the past 40 years to eradicate cannabis through quite staunch criminal prohibition to begin with, and as many will note, the pedal has been eased off of that approach. However, we still have disproportionate criminalisation of our currently marginalised communities. So you see in the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor's report that were we to move to cannabis legalisation tomorrow, it would save 1,300 Māori being convicted for low-level cannabis offences per year. So effectively, the discussion is not one of whether we like or support cannabis, which can cause harm. The question is one of how we best approach that cannabis, which can cause harm, to reduce that harm and to increase community wellbeing. It's about the structures, the laws, and the environments that we create around it. We know right now and Joe will delve into this evidence in much greater detail, but that, of his cohort that he studied, we actually have some of the greatest research on cannabis here in Aotearoa as a result of both the Christchurch and Dunedin longitudinal studies, that of those cohorts, around 80% of New Zealanders will use cannabis by the age of 21. That was a generation where it was more likely to be policed through that criminal lens. There is now, of course, slightly more leeway in police discretion, meaning that arguably it could be potentially even higher. So effectively, we have a status quo which is stopping next to nobody from getting access to cannabis if they want it. Whether you're 15 or 50, you can get hold of it. The problem with that status quo is that people who do experience harm do so typically in the shadows. Who is going to come forward and hold themselves out as needing help when it means admitting that they have done something wrong and risk going away in handcuffs? You add on top of that the fact that drug dealers from tinny houses do not check ID, and worse than that, potentially, that they are potentially inclined to sell or to hustle more harmful substances. Here I'm talking particularly about the most harmful substance that we know across our marginalised communities in this country, methamphetamine, when they don't necessarily immediately have access to that cannabis. And here are worthwhile to allude to the common kind of myth of the gateway theory, that being the correlation between people who graduate to harsher substances having used cannabis as well. And there we can see that people who have had to interact actually with the black market are likely to graduate to harsher substances. So anybody who is engaged in the scientific or evidential bases will know that correlation and causation are two quite different things there. And I would argue that the far more harmful side of that equation is needing to engage with the criminal underground. So effectively, from the approach of a lawmaker, from the approach of a policymaker, when you're wanting to regulate a substance, you have a spectrum of options available to you. That spectrum ranges from, on the one end, the kind of complete prohibition that we have at the moment, where you have control effectively by the black market. And we've seen that that approach has continued the proliferation of cannabis, and interestingly enough has actually resulted in what's called the iron law of prohibition, whereby the substance has continued to get more and more harmful, more and more potent, so that more, or rather less of that substance can be shifted for greater potential high. On the complete other end of town, the other end of that extreme in the spectrum, you have complete free market or complete kind of commercialization, where corporates and multinational organizations are able to advertise, to sponsor, to glamorize and to normalize their substance. Both polar ends of that spectrum of legal approaches offer the peak of potential harm to our communities. Because in both of those instances, you have entities that are willing to exploit, even incentivized to exploit our vulnerable communities in order to make a quick buck. So how you start to peel away from that end of town of deep commercialization, which I would argue our alcohol kind of regulation is too far down the track of, and move away from that complete prohibition, that complete black market control, is you move into a space of regulation. Regulation is only available by virtue of legal control. And this is where I want to tackle head on perhaps one of, again, the biggest misconceptions around the idea of legalization. A lot of people, particularly proponents of continued prohibition, like to conflate the idea of legalization with liberalization. I would argue that we have an incredibly liberal model at present. And as I said, the most liberal models that you can get are that complete prohibition or that complete commercialization. What we're actually looking to do is go into that space of regulation, where you have more involvement from the state in the regulation of potency and the regulation of who can access, where they can access, how much they can access, and movement to wipe out the black market. Now here I'm not at all naive enough, or I don't think anybody who has been engaged in the shifts and movements of black markets towards legal markets would ever assume that something like that is going to happen overnight. But what a movement towards legalisation, control and regulation offers us is a suite of variables that we do not have control over when we are opting for prohibition. And here I reference Kylie Quince, who was actually a former law lecturer of mine back at uni, but she now is an incredibly prominent and brilliant Māori academic who focuses particularly in advanced criminal law. And the way that she places it is that prohibition is effectively this blanket one-size-fits-all law. What you have with the Cannabis Legalisation and Control Bill is 170 odd pages of how we approach this with nuance and complexity to ensure that we are informing adults of the harm that can potentially come to them, but making sure that they are adequately educated to make decisions about what they're putting into their body. Noting that hundreds of thousands of Kiwis are doing this every day right now without that wraparound education, nor the duties of care on their sale, on the people who are selling and supplying the substance to them. So the high-level principles of this law are available in bullet point form on referendums.govt.nz. That is the preferred terminology that the Ministry of Justice has decided to go with for the two referenda that you're facing. There was a little bit of kind of interesting dialogue about the terminology, whether it should be referenda or referendums, but we have referendums.govt.nz, and there you can see the outline of the End of Life Choice Bill, which I understand was debated or discussed in the Cathedral just last weekend with leadership from the Honourable Ruth Dyson, who I've come to know and love over the past 3 years. But you'll also find the outline of the Cannabis Legalisation and Control Bill. And you can find the full bill if you'd like to read that, and I'd highly encourage that if you do have concerns or want to understand how this is going to work. But otherwise, there is the opportunity to unpack some of that nuance and that complexity and that so-called legalese without needing to read through a very dense document. So the high-level principles inside the bill, its general purpose is guided by a number of things. The key is to reduce cannabis-related harm to individuals, whānau and communities by providing access to legal cannabis that meets quality and potency requirements, eliminating the legal supply of cannabis, raising awareness of the health risks associated to cannabis use, restricting young people's access to cannabis, limiting the public visibility of cannabis, requiring health warnings on packaging at the time of purchase, improving access to health and social services and other kinds of support for families and whānau, and making sure that any breach of the law is fair in its proportionate response, whether it's through at the worst end of things, the criminal justice thing, but the criminal justice response, but preferably, obviously, the public health response. So I think fundamentally, the question, as best summarised by Helen Clark, who obviously is our former Prime Minister and now sits on the Global Commission on Drugs, recommending, based on international best practice, different approaches to reduce harm in our communities. And they actually reflect on having been at the Vienna Convention in the UN on narcotic drugs in 2018. That's the birthplace of the so-called war on drugs, where worth knowing that in 1998 they all came together and said, we are going to criminalise and penalise drugs as hard as we possibly can, with the aim of eradicating drugs from planet Earth by 2008. That was 12 years ago, and the problem has got so much worse with that attempt at approach. You have now, and my mind was blown when I was at the Vienna Convention with officials and politicians going up on the podium and giving reports on their country's progress, saying we have more people dying of overdoses, we have more families torn apart, we have more people in prison, we're spending more on criminalisation. We have to keep doing more of what we've always done, but do it harder. I think that that's probably my time to wrap. But that to me is kind of best summarized in something that my old man always says, which is that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of stupidity. And we have an option here to take a different approach to increase the well-being of our communities. The final thing that I'll leave you with is the common parallel to our smoking, our tobacco legislation and regulation. People often say things like, well, if you were trying to get to smoke-free 2025, why would you legalize cannabis? I think they forget that that's exactly the point. The reason that we have managed to get anywhere close to minimizing young people's access to the glamorization and normalization of tobacco is through the suite of different legal controls that are available to us through legal regulation of tobacco. It is only through controls on price, controls on how packaging looks, those warning labels, through controls on where people can access, and obviously banning sponsorship, advertising, and product placement, that we've come to be anywhere close to getting to that target of smoke-free 2025. And if we want to reduce particularly our young people's access to cannabis, then we need to do that through taking a different evidence-based approach, and that is only through legal control. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for that presentation, Chloe. Fantastic. I think we'll move on now to Joe and invite you to speak as well. Joe's here in person, so I'll give him the microphone. And we look forward very much indeed to what you have to say.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much for inviting me here. This is the second time now in 2 days that I've had to follow Chloe in speaking, and she is a hard act to follow, I have to say. A great deal of respect for her. I want to start with just a few facts about cannabis in New Zealand that you may or may not know. In New Zealand, cannabis is the fourth most commonly used psychoactive drug after caffeine, alcohol, and tobacco, and in fact, in some age groups, it's more popular than tobacco. So for some age groups, it's the third most commonly used psychoactive drug. New Zealand is 9th in the world for cannabis consumption, for total cannabis consumption, and all of that we consume is grown here in New Zealand. So it's not imported. It was imported originally. And in fact, when cannabis was made illegal in New Zealand, there was in fact very little cannabis in New Zealand at the time. The reason it was made illegal was because we were a signatory to United Nations compacts around this issue. Consumption in young people had previously been quite high, and I'll say a few words about a group of 43-year-olds in a moment. But it's actually declined between the year 2000 and 2012 and has remained about steady since at about 4% past year use in people aged 15 to 17 years old. So the reason I'm here is that I am the director of the Christchurch Health and Development Study. I've been a member of the study for the past 15 years, and I've been the director for a year. The study is a group of 1,265 people born in Christchurch in the middle of 1977, between April and August. Those infants entered into the study by their mothers represent 97% of the births in Christchurch during that period. So it's in fact the population of people born during that period. They've been studied from birth all the way to age 40. We visited them annually to age 16 and then periodically since, and we saw them last 3 years ago. And of course, as you might imagine, over the course of those 40 years, we collected a wide range of data from their parents, primarily their mothers, teachers, the cohort members themselves from when they were 7 years old, their partners and friends, and we have official record data primarily around justice and health. So there's an absolutely huge amount, about 60 million characters worth of data collected on health and psychosocial outcomes, as well as social, family, individual, and demographic factors. And from when the cohort members were age 13, we started asking them about their cannabis use. And the first question we ever asked them was, have you ever tried using cannabis? And at age 13, 5 of them told us they had. By age 15, that number had grown to 10%, and by age 18, that number had grown to 50%. And by this point, in our study's history, 80% of our cohort has reported using cannabis on at least one occasion, and that is the same number as reported by the Dunedin Multidisciplinary Health and Development Study, which their cohort is about 4.5 to 5 years older than ours. So typically what we do in the CHDS is, with respect to substance use, is we look at population patterns of substance use and substance use disorder. And we want to investigate possible causal mechanisms that link earlier experiences and characteristics with later maladaptive behavior. So just a couple of other things, noting, first of all, that despite the fact that for their entire lives, the lives of this cohort, that cannabis was a prohibited substance that they weren't supposed to access, 80% of them had accessed it at least once. And 35% of those had gone on at some point to become regular users of cannabis, which means at least weekly or more often. And of these people as well, about 15% will have met criteria for what's now called a cannabis use disorder, with males having about twice the risk of females. Now, a couple of other important things to note about how the law has interacted with our cohort. And when they were 21 years old, we had a look at people's arrests and convictions for cannabis offenses, and we were able to verify this through the official record data, that these were indeed cannabis related. And of the people who were arrested or convicted, 95% of them either continued to use cannabis at the same rate or increased their use, which suggests that having the force of the law applied to you personally is not a deterrent. And finally, and to me, one of the most important aspects of this is that our cohort at birth, approximately 13% were of Maori ethnicity, and Maori cohort members were 3 times more likely to be arrested or convicted of a cannabis offense, and that's after adjusting for different rates of use between Maori and non-Maori, which suggests that the law is being applied in a racially biased manner. Now, we were part of, historically, our study, part of the vanguard, I suppose, in psychiatric epidemiology, looking at the psychosocial harms associated with cannabis use. The papers started to come out in the late 1990s and the following decade and continue to do so looking at this, but I just want to cover a couple of key aspects of this. One is that we find that there is a link between earlier and heavier use of cannabis and what we call an amotivational syndrome that manifests itself in poorer educational outcomes, so a lower likelihood of achieving educational qualifications, whether secondary or tertiary, and following on from this, a greater likelihood of long periods of unemployment of 3 months or more in early adulthood. So starting cannabis at a younger age and using more frequently at younger ages are associated with this amotivational syndrome. The second issue, as Chloe will have mentioned, is the idea of the cannabis gateway. That is it possible that cannabis use actually increases the risk of using other illicit drugs? Now, in our study, the answer is actually yes. Cannabis use is associated with an increased risk of using other illicit drugs, particularly, again, if you start at a younger age and you're using more heavily at younger ages. And in fact, by age 25, if you are a regular cannabis user, at least weekly at some point in your life, your chances of using other illicit drugs are about 10 times higher than people who haven't used cannabis. Now, it's a bit of a fiddly number, and that's because it's difficult to calculate this counterfactual state of affairs, but that's roughly but that's roughly correct. And the third, and possibly the one that you will have heard quite a lot about, is the linkage between cannabis and psychotic symptomatology, where again, use at younger ages and more frequent use is associated with an increase in psychotic symptomatology, which is reported when the person is not acutely intoxicated with cannabis. So we're not talking about any experiences they might have when they've had cannabis, but rather afterwards. Now, we've looked at other areas of cannabis-related harm. Those are the three main, what I like to refer to as the main areas. Now, having said that to you, and I'm here as a public health researcher who has looked at these harms, but these harms have occurred under a prohibition regime where people aren't meant to be using cannabis. And as Chloe pointed out, the availability of illicit drugs, despite the ramping up of the drug war around the world, and in some places where drug users and drug dealers are shot on sight, really isn't actually putting a dent in it at all. So you might wonder, as a public health researcher, why am I standing here actually advocating for cannabis law reform? Because you probably will have heard me do this before. Well, I completely agree with Chloe's point in that it's very difficult to actually put any regulation around a substance or protect people if the answer is, well, you simply shouldn't do this and we're going to pretend the problem will go away. Now, if prohibition actually worked, if we were able to eradicate or completely control the supply of cannabis in this way, we might have a chance at that. But the problem is, it's everywhere, it's already out there, and controlling it is a practical impossibility. So, in order to protect young people's health, what should we do? Well, I want to give a couple of examples of how I think legal regulation might actually help the situations that I've outlined for you in our data. So, for example, with educational opportunities, one of the big issues in this is that cannabis is one of the few things that gets you automatically excluded from school. Right? So typically having tobacco or alcohol on your person or being involved in it is not suitable grounds for exclusion, but a school board will exclude people automatically for any involvement in cannabis use. I know this to be true because my daughter's friend was excluded from, was actually intermediate school for this. If we can reduce school exclusion, those who are struggling with a problem with cannabis or who are using at younger ages are more likely to be able to get help and remain in school and continue on their educational pathway. In terms of the gateway study, we observed this cannabis gateway in New Zealand where cannabis is prohibited, but a similar study was carried out in the Netherlands nearly 20 years ago. And as you may be aware, cannabis has been decriminalized in the Netherlands for the past 46 years. It is sold in coffee shops, which are licensed premises, where people can consume it there or in their home. Now, of course, the supply to these coffee houses is illegal, but it is perfectly legal to purchase it at the coffee house. And they did a very similar study to ours and found no gateway linkage. There was no relationship between cannabis use and other illicit drug use. The idea being that if you're a cannabis user in the Netherlands, you don't need to go to a drug dealer, or your friends don't need to go to drug dealers in order to get the cannabis that you want to use. You can go to a perfectly safe premises and get it and use it without interacting with drug dealers who frequently have other products to sell. Now, in terms of the psychosis link, the culprit in the psychosis link is believed to be the THC content in the plant material, which, as has been well publicized and mentioned by Chloe, has increased over a period of years due to selected breeding under the iron law of prohibition, which is that prohibited drugs tend to get stronger in terms of their formulation in order to earn more money for selling smaller amounts. It lowers the risk for dealers. Now, this psychosis, I have to say, is typically not what we're not referring to full-blown psychotic illness that occurs de novo, but rather more common symptoms. In fact, the most common symptom, irrespective of your level of use of cannabis in our cohort, was I was reporting the symptom, I sometimes have thoughts that other people do not share, which is an extremely mild symptom, particularly as compared to the more serious symptoms that can occur in a psychotic illness. But one way that cannabis legalization and control could assist with this is through, well, two means. One is through clear product labeling. That is, the consumer of the product knows precisely what's in it and knows exactly the concentration of the psychoactive compounds, in particular THC, and caps on levels of THC in products sold, which will provide a safer experience for consumers. Now, I don't think that anyone who's advocating for law change is trying to say that this is going to solve all our problems that are related to cannabis use in young people. The good news is that, as I mentioned previously, cannabis use has declined over a period of years in particularly the most vulnerable 15 to 17-year age group. And this is the group that we want to keep cannabis out of the hands of. It's certainly easier to do that if you require ID for them to actually get past the door, rather than the situation as it is now, where it's easily accessible for these young people. But I also think that we overlook something when we think about the possibility that young people might take this up of their own initiative. Over the past period of 20 years, use of cannabis has declined, and I think that we actually really need to give young people some credit. When I was a young person, I had to rely on what older people told me, and mostly it was scare stories about drugs and things like that. But young people have access to a great deal more information now than they ever have before. In fact, most of them have the entire library of knowledge available to humans on a device in their pocket. And they make use of this very well. And I think we need to give young people credit for that, but also realize that they're probably a lot smarter than we think they are, and I don't think that they will necessarily fall prey to anything following a change in the law. So I'd like to thank you for your kind attention and just acknowledge my collaborators, so Emeritus Professor David Ferguson, who sadly passed away 2 years ago, my predecessor, Professor John Horwood, the Christchurch Health and Development Study and their families, and our funders, the Health Research Council of New Zealand and the Canterbury Medical Research Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that really informative contribution. So now I'd like to call on Deborah Stevens to make hers. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to acknowledge my husband Robert as my technical assistant. Tēnā koutou katoa, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this panel. It is a real privilege to be here. As you've already heard, and I suspect you are here because you know, this is a complex issue. It's not as simple as all drugs are bad, cannabis is a drug, therefore cannabis should be illegal. And it's not as simple as cannabis is a normative thing in New Zealand community, therefore cannabis should be legal. I want to explore with you the consequences of a yes vote and a no vote, because whichever way we vote, there will be consequences. If you vote yes, there are a significant number of issues with the Cannabis Legalisation and Control Bill that may go through to Select Committee, and I'm going to address 3 of those. And if you vote no, of course, the status quo remains. And the status quo isn't working, especially for our young people and especially for marginalised communities. So let's look at the legalisation bill. Firstly, the proposed Cannabis Legalisation and Control Bill is based on a commercial model. The bill enables a commercial industry that creates new businesses. Now, new businesses want to grow, and new businesses want new users so that they will grow. So in this way, the commercial model that's in the proposed bill is directly at odds with one of the bill's aims, which of course is to reduce cannabis use over time. So one of the issues with the bill is the commercial for-profit model, which is at odds with reducing cannabis over time. Secondly, the bill's unlikely to eliminate the black market, and there are 3 reasons for this. The first reason's price point. The price for legal cannabis has got to hit a Goldilocks zone, not too high, not too low. The price for legal cannabis needs to be low enough to draw people away from the black market, whilst at the same time enabling the businesses to make a profit and continue. And if the price for legal cannabis is set too high, too far above the illegal price, then many users are likely to continue to use the black market. Canada, as you probably know, has a commercial model for legalised cannabis. And in Canada, if you purchase cannabis from a legal source, you pay around $10 per gram. If you purchase cannabis from an illegal source, you pay around $6.37 per gram. Now, some customers are going to be willing to pay that 1/3 premium in order to not have to deal with the black market, but also to ensure the quality and the consistency of the product that they are consuming. But this price differential actually privileges those who can afford it. Now, New Zealand statistics show that people in marginalised communities are high users, and they're the folk who can't afford the premium, and so will, it could be argued, continue to use the black market. So in this way, the price differential, or the price point, may continue to exacerbate some of the inequalities that already exist. And I'm going to come back to those inequalities, those inequities in just a moment. So price point is one reason why the black market will survive. A second reason that the commercial model in the proposed legalisation is unlikely to eliminate the black market is that the bill allows certain types of cannabis products, but it restricts others. This means that products not allowed by the bill will only be available in the black market. Now, there are new cannabis products being developed all the time. So in addition to the hash, the oil, the dried flower for smoking that was historical, we've now got products that include edibles, chocolate, cake, sweets, including the infamous gummy bears, and a myriad of others. We've got products such as topical creams, drinks, chewing gum, lubricants, and even suppositories. The third reason is potency. The bill sets a maximum potency of 15% THC. THC, of course, is the ingredient in cannabis that gives you the high. However, there are many products that contain a higher level of THC than this, including the ones that I've just mentioned. If such products aren't legally available, then the black market will move to fill any demand. California has a legalised recreational cannabis, It did so in 2016. Its black market is worth $3.7 billion, and that's actually 4 times larger than its legal model. And from research in Canada, it actually appears that their black market has grown, not become less, since they legalised cannabis. Now, there's a possibility, of course, that that's a short-term effect, because when we look at alcohol prohibition, it took some time for the black market in alcohol to disappear. However, what is clear is that we can't rely on the bill to eliminate the black market. My third issue with the bill is this. There's a danger that too many commercial cannabis outlets will be located in marginalised communities. To illustrate this, I'd like us to consider the example of junk food and the junk food market. A group of students, inspirational students called the Warrior Scholars from Kia Araha College in South Auckland, used the Streetwise program to plot food outlets in the community of Otara, and then to compare that with food outlets in the community of Botany, just 6 kilometres away. So the red dots, they show outlets that sell poor quality food, food of low nutritional value. So those are outlets such as the big fast food chains or dairies. The blue dots show outlets where healthy food is available. So that's a supermarket, a fruit tray, and so on. Now, one sweep of the map shows the concentration of junk food outlets in Otara and the lack of nutritional options. So just like junk food outlets, there's a risk that cannabis outlets will be concentrated in more deprived communities. And certainly if we look overseas, we see this evident in Canada and in the states of Oregon and Colorado. There's a seduction in the notion that if we vote yes, we put cannabis under government control and regulation, that everyone will be looked after and all will be well. However, the evidence shows that voting yes for regulation and commercial sale doesn't mean that all will be well. We need to carefully consider and discuss the commercial model proposed by the bill, and if we don't, we may end up further harming people, and particularly those in our marginalised communities. So I've looked at issues with voting yes, and the fact that there are significant problems with the commercial model that's proposed in the bill. The commercial imperative is at odds with cannabis reduction, the black market will still exist, and there is a risk that marginalised communities may suffer further negative impacts. However, if there's a no vote, we're left with the status quo. The harms of the moment remain, and the law is problematic, as both Chloe and Jo have covered. Arrest and conviction for cannabis offences doesn't result in a reduction in cannabis use. Arrest and conviction for cannabis uses does nothing to address the psychological harms or the physical harms that may be caused by cannabis use. And what it does result in, of course, is lifelong restrictions on people's employment, housing, and educational opportunities. So whether it's a no vote or a yes vote, it's what happens after the referendum that's important. If the vote is no, then we've got to address the harms and use the time to gain more information from overseas jurisdictions that have legalised recreational cannabis. And if we vote yes, then we've got an opportunity to explore alternatives to the commercial model, including not-for-profit regimes, perhaps cannabis social clubs, or maybe the government having more control than handing over to private businesses. But whether yes or no, there's still work to do. Kia ora.
Thank you. Bishop Richard, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you. Some very informative points to think about, and especially for us and our Māori people. One of the things I want to talk about, I've got no anecdotal evidence of what I'm about to say, other than I had spent years as a counsellor, and so I've experienced the results of the effects of cannabis use. Thankfully, a lot of them we were able to rescue before they went on from there to harder drugs. When I think back of it, I think the last time we looked at it, the problem was really with adults. And of course, our children are brought up to look up to our adults and follow the adults' trails. And this is where things went wrong with cannabis, because I think what was happening when they did something back in 2012, 2013, that of the population, 25% of Māori adults were smoking cannabis. Whereas on the other side, I think it was something like about 11% of European, but then even lower, like 9% of other ethnicities. Well, I worked for a long time within the health, both in Nelson, Marlborough and in the West Coast. And one of the things that we looked at is the effects of drugs and things on our people, because our people have lost the ability to look at their well-being. And the well-being I talk about is, many of you may know or heard of the model that Sir Mason Jury brought out, the Whare Tapa Whā, where we encourage our people to look at their whole well-being and move away from those things that affect the ability to keep your well-being in balance. And in my work as a counsellor, I found out that for instance, cannabis affected the spirituality, your spirituality. It affects your hinengaro, or your emotional volitional being, and it also affected your family. And in my experience, what I found out is that you can work on the spiritual side and the hinengaro side, but the last and the hardest to work on was the breakdown in families. So along with this legislation, we need to look heavily at the health and well-being of the individual. Now, you and I know that through the system, the health system, the education system, and also the justice system, that Māori don't fare very well in access to any, apart from the prison. It is a fact that many of our Māori people are in the prisons. Males, somewhere around 50%, almost 50%. Funnily enough, though, the females are over 50%. Māori are in prisons. And many of them are in prison for smoking marijuana or the use of marijuana. Many of them with the first use of it. I'm reminded of something to do with alcohol, because alcohol we know is worse than many other things with our people, of a young person who came from the outbacks of the east coast of the North Island, and for the first time out of his village, he experienced alcohol. He got on the ferry and into the bar, and the police were waiting for him on the other side because of his behaviour on the boat. I think it was something like 43 years later that he was released from Ngāwhatu Hospital back to his own people in Tairāwhiti. A sad, sad fact, for the first time ever experienced alcohol. And our people are having the same problem with the first experience with marijuana. Now, I do agree that this legislation has some good in it. The thing is, I'm not sure that we looked at the individual and the people in putting that legislation together properly. It's more towards the law and also, of course, our tax department. Sorry. Nobody's mentioned that yet, but I'm pretty sure that it's got a huge amount to do with this, because you can't tax the black market. And the black market keeps our police force employed. So, you know, where's the balance here? My plea is for our people is that we do really look at this hard. If the voters were yes, we need to concentrate more on making sure that things are safe. Because my thought is, when you're looking at the price difference, they talked about it to us in Canada, how the difference in the price hasn't done anything towards getting rid of the black market. But in fact, see, over there, every household can grow their own tobacco. And tobacco is the one that is hitting the most over in Canada, more than cannabis, because you can buy tobacco on the side of the road in front of the houses for next to nothing. I don't want to see that happen to cannabis. I know that there may be some byproducts of cannabis that might be handy. You might be able to make handbags out of them or something like that. But my plea is for our people to think very, very carefully before you make the decision. And when you say yes, ensure that you're encouraged to have some input in what the big picture is going to look like in the end for the safety of our people. I just feel for our people out there, because we are in those little brackets like Otara and places like that. Many of our people are unemployed. And there again is why a lot of them end up in prison, because they have to go out and burgle and steal in order to get the money to get that little hit that they need to make them feel well. It doesn't last long, apparently. I don't know, I haven't tried it myself. So it encourages you to go out and do more crime to get another little bit. I'm just blown away by some of the figures that you've used for what was happening to our Māori. That figure I gave you around, that was the research done around about 2012-13, where 25% of Māori adults were smoking, that was coming down. I know that. The problem is that now they can't afford, even on the black market now, cannabis. And you're getting the import of those other substances that are doing our people much more harm than the cannabis itself. In fact, it's killing them. So my plea is that we really, really think about this. Whether we vote yes or no, we need to put ourselves in behind it and do something to help make sure our people keep safe. I think that's really all I wanted to say, and Whatever the outcome, it's going to be difficult for us all. So, nā reira, kore te hia tēnei, he rō tēnei kōrero, e pāno tēnei take, nunui, mō tātou nei iwi. I don't want to, that's all I need to say really for our people, is that let's think of our neighbours, let's keep an eye on our neighbours and look after each other. Nā reira, kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Bishop Richard. And finally, we have a Zoom presentation from Sue Bagshaw. And I see all our technical people right. Oh, here we go. Lovely. Welcome,
Nō
Sue.
reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Lion Rock tuku manga, ko Hong Kong Harbour tuku awa, ko Hong Kong China aho, ko Rangatahi tuku mahi, ko Dean Bagshaw tuku whānau, ko Sue tuku inawai. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Gosh, what a hard act to follow. I hope I'm not going to duplicate any information, but hopefully I can sort of summarize what all the wonderful speakers before me have talked about. As I said in my introduction, I think where you're from actually really influences who you are. And I was born in Hong Kong, so very cosmopolitan and very broad-reaching. I think my interest, most of my work is with young people, so I'm going to try and represent a few things of what they said. I was going to do a little survey of my own and talk to the young people who I see in my work about what they thought about cannabis, but I haven't been able to do that. So I'm going to draw on the Youth 2000 study a little bit. But just to kind of, I want to first of all take you on a wee bit of a journey and try and put into perspective some of the things that we've talked about this morning, and maybe hopefully, think about things a bit more broadly. So I want you to imagine, here's the world, and you're in a little bit of a rocket ship from outer space. But you can see all the different countries as you're traveling around the globe, and you can see the people who are living in Alaska and Greenland and the far north in their igloos, and some of them are scraping off the green stuff that's hanging from the roof, and they're finding that it's giving them great pleasure and taking them on wonderful mind journeys. And you sweep down into North America with the vast tracts of tobacco fields and tobacco plants. You come down into South America with the wonderful cocoa plants, growing beautiful sweet substances, refined with loads of sugar from the Caribbean. And then you come into Europe and you see the vast tracts of vineyards growing wonderful grapes, making beautiful wine that make you feel good. Then you come down through the Middle East and you see the opium poppies and the massive growth of opium in China, and then the Indian tea fields growing wonderful tea that fills you with aromatic fluids, and then the coffee plantations, and then you come down into little New Zealand growing fantastic cannabis plants where it helps you feel good. Having said that, what I'm trying to give you is a bit of a picture of every single person in the world uses some sort of substances, and they use them for different reasons. There's many different drugs. There's the ones we use for medication. And don't get me wrong, many of the drugs that we use for medication are addictive, and you have withdrawal symptoms. We have loads of different kinds of beers. We have lots of different kinds of spirits. So many forms of alcohol. We have tobacco, which we can use in many different forms in terms of the way we smoke it, vaping, whatever. We have cannabis plants, which have wonderful different ways of growing with flowering plants and leaves, and we use every bit of it. We have substances that are made into pills and tablets and all sorts of different forms, including the powders which are used intravenously, which causes all the problems with hepatitis C and HIV. We have the lowly and humble coffee and tea and hot chocolate. And we have the cannabis plant, who we also use for all different reasons. And the very different reasons that we use these substances range from celebrations, events, special events, group events, whānau events. We have pure and simple socialization. Some people say alcohol is the social lubricant of the world. We sometimes use substances when we're angry to calm us down, when we're frustrated and stressed, when we're disappointed, when we're worried, when we're plain downright depressed, to try and escape those horrible feelings that sometimes overwhelm us. Some of us use it as a food. Remember, alcohol is a drug, not a food. And cannabis is used in exactly the same way. So what does cannabis do? Well, it's a natural substance made in the brain, produced when exercising a lot to help endurance. We know that, in the good old days, back in hunter-gatherer days, that when you have to run a long way when you're hunting, you need opiates to help with the pain and cannabinoids to help with that endurance. So the brain makes both. There's loads of different forms, as everybody's alluded to. THC is the one that really works on elevating mood, but various other bits of the cannabis plant or the chemicals derived from it do lots of things like decrease fits, help with multiple sclerosis, anti-inflammatories, help with pain. It comes as we heard, comes in very many different forms: oil, tablets, powder, leaf, can be smoked, eaten, rubbed on the skin. We have an oral spray. But what other effects does cannabis has? Well, there's good and bad, as with everything. Helps with anxiety, decreases nausea, makes a person feel at peace. A lot of young people tell me they feel at one with the world and really calm. Helps with chronic pain. No one has ever died from using it. But if you smoke it, it can become not a good thing for your lungs, and bronchitis is much worse, probably worse than tobacco effect. As Joe pointed out, it decreases memory, it slows down reactions, but that depends on the dose. You very rarely become really dependent on it, but certainly psychological dependencies can happen. And as Joe pointed out, it can cause schizophrenia in people who are prone to it. A lovely psychiatrist said to me once, some people have a brain like a Swiss wristwatch, and you put anything in it or you can breathe in it, it's normally incredibly accurate, but if you pump it in any way, it goes downhill. Some people have a brain like a Swatch watch. You can throw it down the loo and it doesn't get altered. Unfortunately, the people who have cannabis or are prone to it have a brain like a Swiss wristwatch, and they don't want to put anything inside it that's going to cause it to any imbalance. So I think we have to be really careful about who takes it. But what are the harms? As we've already alluded to several times, 334,000 adults regularly smoke cannabis in 2018, compared to 800,000 heavy drinkers in that time. We have many of them being charged with cannabis offences, and we've heard about the disproportionate number who are young, Māori and male. But don't forget, those who are in prison leave behind whānau. They leave behind women and children who are having to fend for themselves without any support, and that's probably as damaging as being in prison. What's the cost? It costs about $10 million a year to keep people in prison or to charge them with cannabis. 497 people were sent to prison for cannabis in 2018, and it costs $91,000 to keep someone in jail for 1 year. Most of the people in prison for cannabis, it's usually shorter than a year, but if they were all put in prison for a year, that would be more than $45 million a year. So there's a cost. what might be the effects of the new law? Gosh, well, we've heard those brilliantly outlined, and I thought that was a very, very good outline of what the effects might be, yes or no. But certainly there'll be less justice money spent through saved legal costs. Yes, you're right, there'll be lots of taxes, but those taxes can be put into use in terms of treatment for all alcohol and other drug issues, which is poorly funded at the moment. There may be less harm from the criminal world, but that's yet to be seen. Definitely beneficial medicinal effects as well as the recreational effects. And it will be much easier to do health education, as Chloe pointed out, and there'll be less stigma for people seeking help. But on the other side, you're absolutely right. Gangs could gather plants together because, as the law says, we can legally be growing up to 2 plants each in our gardens. So gangs could gather together all that and produce a cheaper and higher effect supply. People could, under 20, could get hold of it, like they do alcohol at the moment. But in other countries, actually, the rates by young people haven't increased. Driving will be regulated and workplaces will be tested, whether it's legal or not. So that's an important point. So what's the effect on young people? Well, we've heard about the amotivational syndrome, which may lead to problems in terms of poverty and unemployment, but so does exclusion from school, as was pointed out. There may be effect on schizophrenia. Think about the effect of alcohol on young people. Lots of aggression. Alcohol's an aggressogenic drug. Lots of fighting and, not such good effects. So I'm thinking we need to be regulating alcohol the same as we're planning to regulate cannabis. But let's look at the effect on the brain. So when we learn, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, it's pretty technical stuff, but basically you transmit a little chemical, goes across the gap between the different nerve endings, and then the more you transmit, the more receptors get made. And that principle is important in terms of the effect on memory, but also the effect on endorphins, endocannabinoids, dopamine, and serotonin. The more you have transmitted, the more receptors you create. And when that's happening in a developing brain, that creates the need for more substance to fill those empty receptors. Alcohol does it quicker than cannabis, but from all of that, what it needs to be known is that there is a definite basis for not giving any drug at all to young people under 20 while their brains are still developing, because all you do is create problems for the future. So different effects, I'm not going to go into it, but in terms of comparing cannabis with alcohol, but certainly they both have effects we don't want to give young people. And the main effect is on the memory. And when you're a young person trying to remember stuff for exams and do lots of learning for the future and employment and all that kind of stuff, not a good look to be damaging your memory, whatever drug you're using. So again, that importance of making sure that young people realize not to use it. And the good news is that actually the Youth 2000 survey series, which are done in high schools across New Zealand, random sample of our population. These are just the numbers that happened in 2001, and we've just hot off the press. The survey results for 2019 have been released just last week. So what it shows is, just as Joe said, young people today are pretty sensible, probably much more sensible than we were. And they're using the information and the use is decreasing. And you can see that both tobacco, cannabis, and alcohol has been decreasing since 2001. And that decrease is being maintained. But not so much in Māori communities, as Bishop Richard said, and not so much in are gender and sexual minorities. So those minorities peoples are using more cannabis than the average, if you like, school student. And you wonder why. Interestingly enough, the good things that have been growing is family relationships are getting better. In 2001, 50% of young people said they wanted more time with their parents than they were getting. Now it's like 70% are getting the time they want. Brilliant. That family whānau support is really growing, which is fantastic. And I think contributing to some of the kind of less use. Having said that, access to quality healthcare for all young people is still a barrier. Whether you're Māori, Pacifica, or Asian or European. Socioeconomic disadvantage has a major impact, and we have to do something about that equality and equity. What the new law will say, I think Chloe covered it, but perhaps I should just sum up with this. You can buy up to 14 grams of dry cannabis, only from a business that has a license. You're allowed to enter licensed premises to consume or buy, but you're not allowed to smoke or vape inside. Obviously, all of this is banned for anyone under 20. You can consume on a private property or licensed premises. You can grow up to 2 plants with a maximum of 4 per household, and you're not allowed to supply anybody under 20. So any cannabis vendor would have to be licensed. And I totally take your point about commercial availability and the commercial model. That was very well made. And you have to have approval for the amount and the quality and the potency. You have to be an approved product, so anything appealing to children is banned, has to come in plain packaging, has to be taxed, and it's only available during opening hours, and locations have to be established in consultation with local community. So again, echoing Richard's plea to make sure that the locations aren't as the fast food operators are, as the synthetic cannabis operators are, as the alcohol operators are within concentrated in local communities. Advertising is banned. So what do our young people want? Well, actually, they don't really mind about the availability of cannabis, alcohol, or any other drug. They want our future saved. They want us to do something about the climate. They want their education to be brought up to date with the 21st century. They want adults to listen to them and connect with them and have fun and support them. So I'm going to leave you with that. And perhaps now is the time for questions.
Thank you very much, Sue. We'll take some applause. So that brings us to the end of the presentations. And what I'd like to do is invite those who have presented physically to maybe come up to the table here, bring a chair if we can, and along with our virtual presenters, we're at a point now where we can take questions for clarification or whatever. So we'll just take a moment to grab a couple of extra chairs and get ourselves up here. Excuse me. That one there's fine, yeah, just grab a chair. It's the great beauty of this place, is it's got a lot of flexibility. I'll get myself a cushion. Right, we don't need the watch anymore. All right, so does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask any of our panellists? Right, here we go.
Thank you. Hello, I'm not talking too loud, am I? It's okay? Okay, right. My name's Holly Kotlowski, and I would like to put this question to everybody who has done their presentations today. So, it seems quite obvious that there is a commercial profit-driven model on offer here with this referendum. So you mentioned in relation to the taxes that some of those tax money could go to alcohol and other drug substance support and rehabilitation and healthcare, related healthcare. I would just like to point out that with the increasing of taxes on alcohol and tobacco over the years, I have not seen anyone present any evidence of how much of that tax has actually gone into alcohol and other drug abuse and addiction treatment, as we seem to have a serious deficit in the provision of these very necessary healthcare services for people affected by alcohol and other drug abuse. So I question the commercial profit-driven model, and I definitely think there's a lot of elephants in the room around this referendum. We've mentioned tax, but like I said, in my opinion, it will just end up in the coffers of inland revenue. We are not going to see a benefit from tax going in to balance. Bishop was talking about te wharitapa whā and obtaining a more holistic and balanced approach to our well-being of our people. So my concern is that this is it's a crappy policy in my own opinion. It doesn't cover the needs to offset the negative aspects that it presents, but that comes as no surprise, being that it's a commercial profit-driven model. And thank you all for your fantastic input today.
Thank you. Who would like to comment first? Joe.
I'm more than happy to. No, Joe can do it.
Go for it.
Apologies, can't see everybody on the table, so just thought that it was worthwhile to address those points. Thank you for sharing your views, Holly. Absolutely hear them and appreciate them. I think it's really critical to point out here that there is a real extrapolation and essentialising of what commercialisation actually is here. If you look into the bill, effectively, when you are seeking to legalise and control the sale and supply of cannabis, you have the option of the state growing and controlling all of it, or you have the option of going complete, free market, which is the extreme end of town that I said that we didn't want, or you have the option of having a restricted market. So the restricted market, which has been outlined in the presentation from Sue, but also as you'll find in the legislation itself, is that no single entity will be able to have more than 20% of market share. There is also a prohibition on advertising and sponsorship, which means that there is the inability to do things like glamorise or normalise, which to Sue's point is actually a really important one, because if we were to apply the same approach that we are looking to apply to cannabis here to alcohol, we would have far less alcohol harm. Actually, and I believe it was about 2014, there was a report or a review on the efficacy, the effectiveness of alcohol regulation led by Graham Lowe under the former national government. It recommended doing things like removing sponsorship and removing advertising, restricting points of sale, unit pricing. It was ignored by that government, and it's also been ignored by the major party in this government. The Greens have a consistent line, actually. If we want to reduce harm of substances, we need to apply those same regulations to reduce and actually completely annihilate any of the glamorisation, normalisation, and to increase education. So actually, it's not at all obvious, and it's actually contrary to the reality that this is a carte blanche commercial approach. It's far, far from it, and is very different, even to what's being proposed in Canada. It's more akin to somewhere in between Canada and Uruguay, which is a complete state-controlled model in Uruguay. So the other thing with regard to taxation, so this is quite a different situation to other forms of levies or tax that are placed on other so-called sin taxes on the likes of our tobacco or our alcohol. What we know about sin taxes is that there is a point at which they are levied beyond the point of efficacy. So as has been stated by a few other people, speakers, you have the issue of if a product on the legal market is at a certain price point, then it is not going to be able to compete with the black market. So that price point in the legal market, which can be tweaked by virtue of those levies or otherwise, is really important to keep constrained to a certain level. But it also means that in kind of economic thinking, and the idea of sin taxes is that you can justify them on a moralistic basis, but you can't necessarily justify them for curbing behaviour beyond a certain point, behavioural economics. So you have to then look at those other different variables around things like point of sale. And there, you would have seen in Sue's presentation, but also you'll find it in the legislation itself, there are explicit barriers on where this product is going to be able to be sold. As the local government spokesperson alongside mental health and addiction spokesperson, it's been really critical to me to make sure that local government is actively involved, having seen the failings of local alcohol policy regulation in particular. So on the taxation, you'll see in the legislation, if you even go to the high-level bullet points on the referendums.govt.nz website, but if you want to, you're more than welcome to look through the kind of legislation that I've spent the last 2.5 years working through. And there is explicitly therein a levy which will go directly into mental health and addiction treatment. So it will go directly to vote health, which is the terminology and the way that budgets operate inside of the government and inside of Treasury. And I will tell you completely upfront that Treasury was not happy with that. They do not like the idea of so-called ring fencing certain pots of money. They like the idea of it all coming back and then being released based on political priorities. But it is explicit in the law as it presently stands. Just the final thing that I would say, right, is that it appears as though right now there is the position of, and I understand that it is a referendum, there is only a binary yes or no. Unfortunately, that is kind of the situation inside of most parliamentary votes as well. But what you are voting on here is for a bill in its current form to progress to first reading and to select committee. At Select Committee, it will be incubated for 6 to 9 months, and there will be the opportunity for members of the public to submit, for it to be tightened up, and for there to be a process of ensuring it works as best as possible. There already has been immense amounts of feed-in from experts. The Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor's report has obviously operated independently of that, but has helped to inform a lot of the thinking. But if you vote no, we end up shutting down this conversation for at least another 10 years. Because I have seen personally, and I'm sure all of you would probably empathise with the fact that politicians are the most risk-averse group of people you could ever meet. Understandably, because decisions that are made have wide-ranging impacts. But having been actively engaged in this issue, which is deeply controversial and is embedded with so much mythology, I have seen just how supercharged some of the moral panics can become. And that to me demonstrates that it will just be seen as such a hot potato that nobody will want to address the harm, let alone the issue. And there's a lot of parallels actually to issues of homosexual law reform and to issues of prostitution reform as well. If we recognise that we have an opportunity to approach this better by having that conversation as a country and progressing law to instigate controls, then that is a vote for yes, effectively. So hopefully that addresses some of your questions.
Thank you very much, other panellists. That's an excellent response, Chloe, and very full. Who wants to go next? Joe? Or... Yeah, I could say it. Yep.
So last year I was invited to go to Wellington to be part of a group of researchers, clinicians, and other people who were interested in this particular space. And we undertook a research project over the course of a day where we developed our preferential model for a legal cannabis regime. And it turns out that in the room we agreed that a not-for-profit model was the best thing. So all of us, in terms of our own preferences, and many of us who have consulted with the Ministry of Justice in this process have actually believed that a not-for-profit model was best. I think what you see in the bill as it's written is reflective of the tension between trying to protect health, but at the same time encouraging people to form a business and become part of this. And it's difficult to say whether you won't know, it's an experiment, whether that balance is correct. There are some safeguards in place. One is that there's a cannabis regulatory authority that will be appointed, and their job is to make sure that the law is being enforced properly and all aspects of it are being carried out as the law has intended. But also there's going to be another body, an advisory body, that some of my colleagues will probably be on, to look at gather evidence, look at the evidence about what's happening and whether there are any changes in population use patterns, harms, and those sorts of things, and make recommendations to the authority to tighten certain aspects of the regulation or to change them as needed. Now these are safeguards. Again, I cannot guarantee you, I can't put my hand on my heart and say that these will work completely as intended, because it is, you're right, an experiment. Having said that, if you read the bill, which again, I'd encourage you to read it, but it's very, very long. It's 161 pages, and it came out during lockdown, so that's how I got to read it. I had enough time being stuck in my house. But it's worth noting that if this were to pass, and all this came to pass, even under what's written, because that won't be the final thing, because it still has to go through the committees of Parliament and debated and all of that, but it's just a hypothetical issue. If it came as exactly as the bill is written, this would be the most regulated product for sale in New Zealand. The single product with the biggest set of regulations around it. I don't know if that makes anyone feel any better.
Thanks. Deborah, do you want to say something?
I'm not certain that there's any evidence that if there is a no vote, that it won't come back up for discussion, because I think that both Bishop Richard and myself, and Sue, I think all of us have said that it's what happens after the vote that is going to be important. Either way, we have got a significant opportunity for input as a public, and the public has a voice. So if it's a no vote, hello people, we've still got to ask, why is drug use so prevalent in our community? We need to ask those questions that Bishop Richard was raising. So we can do that. I'm also thinking, there was so much in what Chloe said, I'm just trying to order my thoughts. Education. Well, of course, we can educate about the harms around cannabis with or without legislation, and our health curriculum does that. We talk to young people about a lot of things that are technically they shouldn't be doing, like sex. You know, we don't leave that till after they're 16. And I'd like to pick up something going right back to the comment that the audience participant made, but it links also with some of the other things that have come through, and that's about the amount of cannabis and comparing us to, say, Uruguay, and then a fully, which is a government model, and then a fully commercialised model with advertising, etc. In Uruguay, you've got a maximum of 10 grams a week. Now, I'm not a cannabis smoker, but I'm told that that's roughly 10 joints. We've got a limit of 14 grams a day. Now, in Canada, such was the supply of legal cannabis at the moment that people are buying their 14 grams. Well, they're not smoking 14 joints. That's giving a lot of your time during the day to cannabis smoking, and then they're supplying the black market with what they can purchase through the legal market. So there are a lot of loopholes. There's a lot to be worked through. If it is a yes vote, then I'm sure that I join every person on the panel with saying, then we as a public must make sure that we've read the bill and that we understand what's going through and that we have an input into select committee with as much evidence as we can supply. If it's a no vote, we need to be asking why, in particular, is the New Zealand community, but importantly our Māori community, our other marginalised communities, why do we have such high rates of cannabis use? And I could say some other things about figures, but perhaps we'll see if there's any other questions first.
I just want to check whether or not Richard or Sue want to say anything. Okay. All right. What
From
about
my
Sue?
point of view, oh, sorry, Richard, go on.
Yep. No, Sue, the floor's yours, Sue.
From my point of view, well, I've always been more interested in decreasing demand than decreasing supply. I think so long as the demand is high, the supply will always be there. So my concern is, yes, absolutely, how do we decrease the demand for any drug? Which seems to me that that's almost impossible because none of us like to live with uncomfortable feelings. So we all search to find something to alleviate our uncomfortable and bad feelings. And you cannot guarantee we're not going to get them because we all get them. So I think part of it is, as a society, getting out of the biomedical model where we look for something to fix it. That's one attitude I'd like to challenge. And the other attitude I'd like to challenge is basically confronting the colonization that's occurred in this country. And I think as a society and as a nation, we need to confront that. We need to actually not just have, Waitangi Tribunal's been great, but we need to look at our reo. We need to look at our attitudes to the people who live in this country so that we can actually take up, to echo our Prime Minister, kindness. We can actually start being less judgmental, more forgiving, and more understanding of each other as human beings. Wow, if we achieve that, we won't need drugs. We've got a long way to go. But, addressing poverty, addressing racism, and addressing a lack of understanding and tolerance that we have in our society, that's what's going to be much, much more effective than any law. But at the same time, we've got a long way to go. But, we can make a start.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent point. Michael Earl.
Thank you, and thank you, Dean, for arranging this panel. We've heard that Canada, Uruguay, Netherlands, Colorado, Oregon, California are amongst the states that have decriminalized. And I was wondering, what have been the key outcomes or the key findings that we've learnt from overseas, particularly in terms of the issues that Bishop Richard was raising about the effect on the Wairua, about the effect on family relationships, and I guess in terms of the rates of imprisonment. What have been the key learnings from overseas?
Who wants to take that one first? Joe.
That's a very good question. One of the issues around this is that the legalization of cannabis for personal use, I tend to use the term personal use rather than recreational simply because I don't think it's any of my business what people use it for. The research is in its infancy. So most of the research is concentrated primarily on whether we can detect adverse outcomes, what are different rates of use in the population, and those sorts of things. So some of the things that you're asking about, while they're really important, they haven't really been looked at. And it's part of really playing catch up because the research arm of things at the population level typically lags about 5 years behind social change. And so we're only starting to come to grips with that. If we assume that one of the key indicators of harm is increased use, the good news is that around the world where it has been legalized, there's very little evidence of increased use in young people. In Canada, in 2018, which had 2 months and 13 days of legalization, 15 to 17-year-olds reported their past year use was 19%. In 2019, which is a full year of legalization, that number dropped to 10%, which seems very dramatic and certainly would almost certainly have something to do with the change in legal status, but we can't really say what it is that has driven that. And whether that will maintain as well is another question. So the signs are that where use is increasing is primarily in older groups. What Canada noticed an increase in middle-aged men, for example. But for young people who we're most worried about, the news hasn't been bad at all. But as I said, many of the questions that you mentioned, which are very important, really haven't been studied particularly well so far.
There are a couple of meta-studies that have just been published, one late 2019, one this year, which I can send you if you see me at the end. What these meta-studies look at is as much information as we can on use in the areas that have decriminalised in the world or legalised in the world. I think it's important to note that if we legalise in New Zealand, we'll only be the third country in the world to do so. South Africa's marginal in terms of whether it's legalised or decriminalised, and they're re-looking at their law, so I'm not counting it. But Uruguay being the first, Canada being the second, we'd be the third in the world. But we can look at the areas where it's decriminalised. The meta-study published this year indicates that decriminalisation doesn't tend to increase use, but there appears to be a slight increase in use in jurisdictions that have legalised. But as Joe's pointed out, a lot of the information that we have is reasonably recent because legalisation has been reasonably recent.
All right, I just want to check whether either of our virtual panellists want to chip in, either Sue
if I
or
may
Chloe.
just briefly.
Yep.
Yeah, kia ora, thank you. Yeah, so as has been really well covered by, two very well-spoken academics there who've covered kind of the research and noted the fact that we don't have an immense amount of evidence bases for what it looks like, what usage looks like, particularly under legalised or decriminalised models, is to note, as Joe said, that we have 47 years worth of research out of the Netherlands, which decriminalised cannabis effectively. Actually had an argument when I was in Vienna at the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs, because technically it's regulated at a local level, but they prefer to say it's decriminalised so that they manage to skirt around some international dramas. But you also have the experience of Portugal, which 25 odd years ago also moved towards a decriminalised model. Here I think it's really important to point out the distinction between decriminalisation and legalisation, because it's another one of those kinds of elephants in the room. Decriminalisation is simply about removing criminal penalties from the people who use the substance. It therefore doesn't deal with the issue of supply. So arguably, and this is actually a legal option that we explored in relation to the synthetics crises, if you solely remove criminal penalties from people who are using a substance, it arguably creates a perverse kind of effect whereby it is easier to try and hawk or sell these illegal products because people don't experience criminal prosecution for consuming them. So legalisation is about taking control of the sale, supply and production of that substance, which enables you to have control over elements like potency, like quality of the substance. Speaking to those international experiences, one of the more fascinating and slightly hilarious things that happened actually in the first week of legalisation in Canada is that there was a massive withdrawal of one of the products on the market because of a mold contaminant. Now, that's something which you simply don't get on the black market, obviously, because there is no duty of care, there are no quality thresholds that have to be met. But that mold contaminant has massive detrimental impacts, particularly on the respiratory system, when inhaled. But that's the kind of thing that you simply don't know about, as with other intoxicants that may be laced in a substance when you get it from the black market. The other thing to note is that we have more than 40 years of criminal prohibition. and we do not have all too much good data on usage at all, where these people are, how they're getting access to it, the kind of ends, the conclusions to that usage. We effectively right now have a system of a free-for-all chaos, whereby unknown people are purchasing unknown substances in unknown places, consuming it to unknown ends. In order to get a semblance of control over that, to bring the issue out of the shadows and into the light, and to begin studying it, you have to move it into that legal framework. So that's what's attempting, or rather starting to be fleshed out now. But we simply don't have that level of evidence gathering at present, and New Zealand is recognised as a world leader in it because of the likes of Joe's work, because we have managed to kind of coax some people out of speaking about their illegal behaviour. But it's very difficult to study whilst it is illegal.
And now Bishop Richard would like to add a comment.
I do agree that it was a great question. Just off the cuff, I'd say that what have we learnt? What has New Zealand government learnt from that is that 100 and how many pages? 61. 161 pages. The problem with that, though, of course, is it unless you got time to study it, it sort of clouds your mind. There are things that have happened in this, and it tends to go back that there's more concentration really on the commercial model than there is on safety of people, because you know, once you start putting restrictions in a model like that, others are disenfranchised. Now, I don't believe this will go anywhere near getting rid of the black market, because there's a huge market, huge amount of people, look at the population that are under 20, that the black market are going to target. It's our young ones. So we may see an increase of cannabis use from our younger people. And the rangatahi, those are the ones that we need to concentrate on more, because they are our future, you know. When I was been listening to Kōrero here, I was thinking about, it reminded me about a great song by a well-known singer, you know, there are more questions than answers. And I believe that this legislation brought up. I think it was important to point out the difference between you know, legalisation and that, because each of those bring up its own rules that we need to do. I mean, it's just simple things. You're not allowed to smoke with your children in the car. But how are you going to police the use of cannabis in a home when you've got children in there? You know, these sort of things. So there are lots of questions still to be asked.
It's coming up to about 10 to 12, and we said we'd finish at 12. We had a couple of really good questions. One more question, I think, and then I'm going to ask each panellist to do one sort of a final statement at the end, if you can. Bishop Peter.
Thank you. There's a desperate need to regulate the supply and sale of methamphetamine. Labs blow up, causing damage to people and homes. There's all sorts of capacity for impure methamphetamine to be sold. I feel this morning I've heard some outstanding arguments for the regulation of the sale and supply of methamphetamine. Why are we not also considering that drug alongside marijuana in terms of legalisation?
Oh, that's a good question. Who wants that one first?
The short answer is that you've got to take it in stages. I think it's absolutely necessary to, and no one argues about the fact that the effect that meth is having on the community, and the fact that it's, I don't think anyone is under any illusions that it's a more dangerous substance for people to be consuming than cannabis is. But the principles that of harm reduction would suggest that a similar set of laws for other substances should, all things being equal, have similar effects. Now, it was just news yesterday that in England, there's a trial underway where heroin is being prescribed to addicts so that they receive clean needles, they receive a pure product, and for the purposes of solving many of the social and personal problems that come with opioid addiction. The trial has been ongoing, and it has been so successful in turning around the lives of people in terms of reducing homelessness, keeping them in jobs, keeping them well, that this trial is being continued. There was a trial in Switzerland earlier on, and a trial in Liverpool in the 1980s that showed the same thing. But I think we need to actually be honest and say that it could work, but at the moment it's a bridge too far in terms of being able to do that.
If cannabis is a natural product, you can grow it in your backyard. Methamphetamine takes ingredients that have to be sourced and aren't readily available. I think Portugal, it's all drugs that are not, they're all legal. So it is a model in places, and there's not complete and utter mayhem in Portugal. But I would also remind everybody that when the changes were made to the Misuse of Drugs Act just recently, that effectively give us a sort of de facto decriminalisation of cannabis. It wasn't just cannabis. We have a de facto decriminalisation for the small amounts of possession and use of all drugs in New Zealand at the moment.
That's interesting.
Sue.
Yep. Sue Bagshaw.
I would suggest that, again, when we think about the harms of substances, all substances are in the same basket, and therefore we probably should regulate them all, not and make them all legal, but regulated. That will be my view, and I think we'd have a much less mayhem community. Just in terms of methamphetamine, it's a small amount of the drug market, if you like, but it achieves great publicity because it does have life-changing effects, much more so than other drugs do. I would like to point out that the use of MDMA by university students is growing rapidly, probably more than methamphetamine, but it doesn't have so much harm. So we've got to think about the harms as well as the
And if I may just briefly jump in on that, this is typically an argument used in a very flippant manner by people progressing the kind of rationale of attempting to create fear and obfuscation. So I really appreciate the opportunity to address it, because methamphetamine is one of the most harmful substances, despite, as Sue has said, occupying only a small portion of our illicit drug market. So I really want to here clarify some of the biggest misconceptions around what the notion of legalisation actually is, because a lot of people conflate legalisation with liberalisation. They are absolutely not the same thing. We right now have a deeply liberalised market for cannabis. It just exists in the black market. You move away from that liberalisation and put in place safeguards and barriers to access through control and regulation, which is only achievable under a legal model. So here I want to allude to the experience in 1990 of Switzerland, who were experiencing a raft of, basically a heroin epidemic. There were people dying at huge amounts. There were, families obviously being torn apart, needles strewn throughout public parks and the streets. And the Swiss, in their very pragmatic way, Ruth Dreyfus, the president at the time, decided that they would legalise the sale and supply of heroin, which sounds to some like, in the same kind of moral panic that we've had this cannabis debate, throwing open the floodgates and throwing gummy bears from the rooftops. It's absolutely not that. It's about creating a sense of control over supply, and that looks different for different substances with different levels of harm. So how Switzerland went about legalising heroin, the sale and supply of it, is they established these clinics where people who had addiction issues with heroin would go to these clinics and have that heroin administered to them for free by professionals. And that heroin had no impurities because it obviously was not cut with anything to make as much money as possible on the black market. But also, in the words of the Reverend earlier, people were not caught in this 24/7 cycle of getting a high, then chasing getting that high, engaging in criminal activity, violence and theft and petty crime in order to get that high. And in fact, they were provided with wraparound services that got them housing if they needed it, that provided them with subsidized employment for their employers if they needed it, that saw that they could get access to education, that they could reconnect with their family and whānau, that they had opportunity to get mental health treatment, particularly for issues to do with trauma. And they had massive success with it. People no longer had to interact with the black market, and you took out that approach of exploitation of those vulnerable communities. And that is really the key. You know, we had it at the end of Sue's initial presentation, and it reflects the findings of the Mental Health and Addiction Inquiry, which isn't the first mental health inquiry we've had in this country. We've had 2 or maybe 3 in the past, but those have really occupied the space of quite pathologizing, medicalizing the biomedical model, as it was put, of mental health, which attempts to see people as individuals, not as part of society, which connects to the points made earlier about wairua and about the kind of hauora model of seeing our health, te wharetapawha. So on that, we found the kind of nutshell of it, that you can have a biological predisposition, hereditary things that you've inherited from your parents or your grandparents or otherwise, but basically your environment, your circumstances, your life experiences can either turn that up, that propensity to manifestation of those issues, or turn it down. So really, the key focus that all of this evidence and all of this research on mental health and addiction has shown us, that particularly when you're dealing with substance issues, you have to focus on improving people's lives if you want to stop them from engaging in problematic use. But also throughout human history, amongst rafts of different legal approaches, hundreds of thousands of human beings have always used substances to alter their minds. And based on World Health Organization data, 90% of those do so without manifesting an addiction. And I think that that's just one of the many things that has to be acknowledged here, that this is a complex issue that cannot be boiled down to a soundbite. But if we want to genuinely focus on this in the proper way, then it does not belong in the so-called criminal justice system. It belongs in one of public health, of education, of health, of housing, and of mental health.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a bit of a passionate discussion and highly informed. I wonder if we could just have a final statement, 1 minute long, from each person, and then we'll ask for a blessing from Bishop Peter, and then we'll go.
So what actually matters here is what happens after the referendum. So the question is about the legalisation or the Cannabis Control Bill. We're going to be asked, you know, do we support this proposed bill, yes or no? But the actual question is about which choices do we make are going to reduce and minimise harm in our community. And if we vote no, I've already pointed out, as the other panellists have, that we need to address the harms that exist and that which cannabis is causing in our community. And if we vote yes, then there are some things that we need to address in the proposed legalisation bill. I pointed out 3 of those, and there are more. It's what happens after the referendum that's going to be important. But I know that each of us have got to tick one of those 2 boxes, and it is responsible for us to participate in the referendum and to do that. So as we go to do that, I've got some questions for you. Which of your choices is going to most negatively affect let's start again. Who's going to be the most affected negatively by your choice? Who's going to benefit most from your choice? What will such a law change, either way, yes or no, say about the community in which we're living? And what way of living does that choice sustain?
I'd like to follow up that point, actually. At the risk of self-promotion, I was a member of the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor's expert panel on cannabis, and we produced a public-facing report, the purpose of which is to inform you not only about the possible consequences coming from a yes vote or a no vote, but there are a number of topics outlined that could be multiple topics of interest to any of you, and we tried to be exhaustive so that you can choose any topic, look at the research around it, and it will point you to the original papers, not only summaries, but to be able to look at what they were saying, in order to satisfy your mind about any of these issues that you might have in the back of your mind. So that website is pmcsa.govt.nz. There are a number of other topics addressed there as well. But one more thing, just the last thing. 50 plus years of the war on drugs has really been the war on people who use drugs. And I think that it has led us to a mindset where we see people who use drugs as something other than ourselves. That's not us, that's them over there who do that thing. The point of trying to show you how common cannabis use is in New Zealand and the rates of use in these groups is that they are us when we are them. One of the things that law reform in this area tries to achieve is reducing the stigma, reducing the idea of these people as being the other, which is really the worst part about all of this to me.
I think I don't want to influence anybody in the way in which you vote. I have concerns that whatever the outcome is going to be carried on if we have a change of government. I have a concern of whether they're going to stay true to whatever the outcome is, and that we're able to discuss it in public. I want us to look at our terminology, and I think, thank you for bringing that up, is that it's the terminology that we use about drug abuse is wrong in my view. It's people's abuse of the drug that we should be looking at. I'm concerned for our young people. We need to discuss with our young people and have our young people have input into whatever the outcome is. I think that's right.
Thank you very much. Sue, you want to chip in now for the final statement?
I've always thought that the law should protect people, and the law is there to keep us safe and to protect us. So I think that's the important thing to keep in mind when we're voting on laws, and for the law creators to keep in mind, so that as little harm is done to society as possible and a greater benefit as possible. And I think actually the pros and cons have been very well aired today. So thank you, everyone. And I would really encourage you to think about the effects of the vote you make, both on yourself. Can you imagine if we made tea and coffee illegal? What would you do? And think about the effects of that exact same thing on other people.
Thank you very much, and Chloe.
Kia ora tātou te whānau. As well, just to echo the sentiments just raised, I really appreciate the opportunity to have had this space and really appreciate the contributions of all of the speakers today. It's been wonderful to be a part of. And thank you as well to the Cathedral for bringing us all together and for hosting this space. I absolutely I got involved in this dialogue not because I ever intended to be the person who was engaged in drug law reform. It was actually a matter of kind of unintentional circumstances, being the last one around the table when Julianne Genter, who was a Green MP who had a members bill pulled out of the biscuit tin, became a minister, and I ended up taking on the issue of medicinal cannabis. I fell down a massive rabbit hole when I did so and found that we have a deeply racist, institutionally biased system. What you've heard today is that 80% of New Zealanders, if not more, will use cannabis in their lifetime, but you don't have 80% of New Zealanders carrying around convictions. You don't have 80% of New Zealanders carrying those impediments that convictions create on people's lives, to their inability to work, their inability to travel, their inability to gain an education. Fundamentally, what we have an opportunity to do here is to grapple with the reality of the situation and to create a safer framework for our whānau, for our young people, and for our country. And I just, reflecting on those questions put out there by Dr. Stevens, the people who will be most negatively impacted by a no vote will be, in the Prime Minister Chief Science Advisor's report, the 1,300 Māori who are convicted annually for cannabis. Even though I was actively involved in actually the driving character behind the scenes on those amendments to Section 7 of the Misuse of Drugs Act, they as yet have not been applied on the front lines, and police are still very hesitant to enable that discretion. And that discretion is applied on a racist basis, particularly when you take into account things like over-policing of certain neighbourhoods. Therefore, the greatest possible benefit is the opportunity for those who have been sidelined and marginalised in our society to take back control over their lives and to no longer be marginalised simply by virtue of, as Sue has said, preferring one substance over the legal one. And then in terms of what it says about our society, Aotearoa New Zealand has been a leader on so many issues in the past. We were the first country in the world to recognise the reality of prostitution and how women in particular were being put in danger by virtue of the legal framework that we had around it. It wasn't a matter of endorsing the trade or the practice, but it was a matter of recognising that our laws force people into more dangerous circumstances. We have the same option to make those decisions around the laws relating to cannabis. New Zealand was also 30 plus years ago the first country in the world to institute a framework for national needle exchange services, which means that we have the lowest number of HIV/AIDS amongst intravenous needle users, drug users. Again, all of these things we've done in the past, and we've clapped ourselves on the back for doing them, but we have the opportunity to do that kind of stuff again and to keep people safe. So that's my kind of parting words. And I'd say as well, it was a damn hard job to bring this conversation forward publicly and politically. So I can guarantee you that politicians are not going to pick it back up in a hurry if we don't manage to take this opportunity and run with it.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the panellists for your contributions, for making time to be here today. We've really appreciated it a great deal, and I've learned a lot, and I know that most of us in this room will have learned a lot. Maybe we'll give a round of applause to all of them. And I'm going to ask Bishop Peter to give a final blessing.
Thank you. Why don't we stand? We've been seated for a while, and let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you that we've been able to gather here under level 2 to hear so many thoughtful contributions and questions and issues raised, and to be reminded that this is a complex issue, whether or not as a nation we vote yes or no. And as we head towards that vote, we ask that you would give us wisdom, to us as individuals and to the collective mass of us as we go into the polling booths. And we pray that the decision made will then lead and guide us forward as a nation, and that we will make the most and the best of whatever that is. Amen.
Thank you. And that concludes our seminar. Thank you.
I so wish there had been a right of reply to that.